Hey guys, it's crazy. Time flies. I know this has been interesting for a lot of you. I've been getting a lot of emails. Certainly, online is not the ideal situation for a lot of people, especially when we have a lab class such as mine. So, if this is something other than just taking an elective course, if this is something that is in your field of study, please get a hold of me when we come back in the fall because we'll be teaching face to face, hopefully, and you'll be more than welcome to come in and watch some of these labs that we weren't able to do because of coronavirus. So again, I have no problem with that. Not only that, but there's going to be when you go through your book, there's certainly so many different crimes that occur, violent crimes that we didn't specifically talk about. And I understand that. We try in this class to just broad brush what an investigator does. Clearly, when you get into a specific field, whether it's robbery, auto theft, it's gangs, organized crime, those types of things are going to have specific things attached to them. You know, and I got a lot of, but I hit the dead bodies with Chapter 8 and death investigations more because I know a lot of students are interested in that, mainly because of a lot of TV shows that we watch. Keep in mind, it doesn't happen a lot, fortunately. So there's just not a lot of homicides out there compared to other crimes. In fact, as we see that it's the most that's reported in the news. It's the least likely thing to happen actually out there. So it doesn't really happen a lot. But I did get a lot of questions about, how do we define these mass killings and stuff. And again, I don't know where someone sat down and said, this is how we're going to do it. But let me give you a couple of definitions because they are confusing. Many times when you're watching the news anchors get it wrong, technically by definition. So remember, a multicide, when we talk about a multicide, it's the killing of a number of victims by one or more persons kind of meeting together in concert. So that's a multicide. When we talk about a mass murderer, so when you hear someone say, this person was a mass murderer, it's clearly a homicide, but what we're looking for is four or more victims at a single event. Single event, four or more victims, kind of like the Aurora movie theater suspect went into the movie theater and killed a number of people. One event, four or more victims. When we say a spree murder, the spree murderer, SPREE, is the killing of three or more people. And again, I don't know why we chose three, but we defined it as three or more people in a relatively short time period, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at one event. It'd be like somebody, we were chasing an ex law enforcement officer from Los Angeles, LAPD, a couple years ago, and he was driving down the road, killed a couple of people, drove to a small town 10 miles up the road, killed a couple more people. So, relatively short period of time, but in different locations. We call that a spree murderer. And then, of course, we hear it all the time, what's a serial murder? So, if you're a serial killer, what defines that? Technically, a serial killer only has to kill two people. So it's two or more people, but they're separate events. There's a time lapse between them. It's killing somebody, waiting a couple of weeks, a month, but that gap in between, and then doing it again. But you can technically be called a serial killer if you only kill two people with that gap in between. So remember, it's that break in between that defines that serial killer. So those were the questions that I was getting a lot of emails about. Why did we get to that point? I'm sure it's a lot of, FBI profilers, the psychology experts that have defined it based on how many people get killed, but that's how we define it. So hopefully the book was interesting enough. Clearly you can see that I've posted the test, the final. It'll just be on Chapter 8. And it'll go over things that maybe we didn't talk about. They're very interesting when you look at it, like what are the things that we find from the body when we find it in water as opposed to outside. So look at those, and some of those will be test questions. But before we leave the course, even though it's not going to be on the test, I want to talk a little bit about the thing that most investigators will come in contact the most. As a police officer and as a detective, without a doubt, the number one call for service is domestic violence. So without going into great detail about domestic violence, just remember this is the number one thing that investigators investigate. Many of these crimes are certainly at a misdemeanor level. We're not going to go into that in depth because that could be a whole semester. But what I want you to understand is, unlike death investigations and homicides that don't happen a lot, clearly domestic violence does a lot. And remember, females are more likely than males to be victims of this. Absolutely. Without a doubt, 85% of abusers are definitely men. I'm not trying to pick on men, but it is what it is. In fact, one of three of women today are going to be victims of domestic violence. So remember, when we start to look at domestic violence specifically, you'll start to find there's a correlation really between domestic violence and really death investigations, especially here in Utah. 50% of the death investigations that we do, the homicides that law enforcement deal with in Utah, are a result of domestic violence. The majority of the time, the suspect is definitely somebody that's attached emotionally to the victim. So clearly we have this correlation between homicides and domestic violence. So as we teach as children to be very cautious of strangers, keep in mind that the majority of this stuff is being done by people that you know. So as an investigator, it certainly helps to have that stat under your belt, because as you start to go out and try and develop a suspect, remember, domestic violence and death investigations, most of the time, you're looking close to home. So keep that in mind. If it's something this is something that you're interested in, come by my office. I have an open door policy. Come by at any time. If it's not during the summer, I'm not there in the summer, but I'll certainly be back there in the fall. Give me a yell. If you have questions about your grade, again, give me a yell. I have to post the grades shortly after last day tomorrow, so try and get stuff caught up and put online. Having said that, get the test done, and we'll see you. Thanks.